Well, this sucks. And we gotta do something about it if we want all our friends to be okay. That is, if we even can. Who dictates what's written into the prophecy? Is it all literal, or is there room for interpretation? If the prophecies are a part of the story, do they paradoxically rely on their own existence to function? All of this is impossible to determine from where we're standing, but Toby's been keen to drop hints about his story before. And for one of his characters, determining what fate should be might be their whole point of existence. Most discussion about Gerson only goes as far as he's old and he's dead and he's the only mentally stable secret boss, but nobody really looks that deep into why he is the way he is. His attitudes, his experiences, his philosophy. All that deep-seated wisdom had to come from somewhere, right? Granted, all that stuff can be pretty complicated when you get down to it, which is why we need to do the one thing Gerson would have wanted the most: reading. I mean, he was a novelist after all, it makes sense most of his depth was conveyed through text. Then, if we can understand what he's trying to say, maybe we'll find a solution to our final prophecy problem. But where to start? Well, we get a good concept of his attitude towards prophecies after he breaks one on the way to his study. We call out his distaste of them and he gives us this. Let's break it down the best we can. Firstly, he calls the prophecies fairy tales, despite their connections to the church and to religion. That's not to say Gerson isn't religious, there's a reason he wrote Lord of the Hammer after the prophecy, after all. But he clearly views the town scriptures as distinct from the reality of the present, which may or may not have put him at odds with his son and his more literal interpretation of the scriptures, but that's a topic for later. Supposedly, to Gerson, the prophecies are best used for comfort, or potentially guidance, and to that end it's the responsibility of the reader to interpret them in a way that's most personally useful. Almost like the forms of escapism we see in previous chapters. Take that as you will. We see this later in the chapter with Susie's reaction to the girl with hope crossed on her heart. But just as Susie becomes blindly optimistic in the search for Gerson, Gerson himself recognizes how knowledge of a predetermined ending preoccupies the mind of the individual, preventing them from making important decisions along the way. You've heard the idea that one finds their destiny on the road to avoid it, right? Well, is it possible that one misses their destiny on the road to achieve it too? That one's perception of what their destiny is becomes false if they aren't careful in guiding their future. This is why Gerson sees reading between the lines as a solution to one's blindness under prophecy. If we see all possibilities of what a prophecy can be, and carefully guide our decisions and environment towards an outcome we believe is possible, maybe we really can take our future into our own hands. To put it simply, Gerson sees the prophecy as trivial, malleable, and an obstacle to one's freedom. Beyond that, we can tell Gerson takes a liking to troublemakers, affirms things the other characters are passionate about, and is generally patient in delivering the truth about himself or the lessons he wants to convey. All this paints a picture of someone who is willing to relinquish control, to let things happen around him, and wants to see that same attitude in the world around him. To put it simply, he is tolerant to the freedoms of others as an example to the universe. It's Gerson's lack of control over his own life, then, that informs us about the origin of his views. He treats others as he wants to be treated. But his attitudes don't change the situation. Gerson is a secret boss for a reason. He shares the same backstory of being trapped and having to reconcile with that. In order to know how to break fate, we need to know what we're up against. And what Gerson's up against are 3 fundamental guidelines that keep the prophecies from being broken. Guidelines that we can pretty easily compare to each of his 3 compatriots. Number 1. Forces out of your control. This is the most obvious one, but conceptually the hardest to fight. It's death in Gerson's example. Though I think Jevil gives us a much deeper insight into how lack of control over certain events can be ruinous to the psyche. As a Darkner, Jevil wanted to fulfill his purpose of serving Lightners, specifically as a playing card. Unfortunately for him, Jevil is a joker, which means he's incredibly unwieldy in card games and generally left unused. Jevil was just being himself. There was nothing he could do to prevent his circumstances, but in his time serving the king at Card Castle, he certainly would have been trying anything to get the Lightner's attention. It was only when he was told about the lack of freedom he had over his fate that he turned to absurdism, a belief that if nothing was controllable, nothing mattered, and relinquished any form of moral constraint over his actions, becoming a threat to society. This was the only means of control in his mind, and Gerson had every right to feel the same. Number 2. Human impulse, or person impulse, I guess? Anyways, this is Banton's problem. The man was simply built to scam people, even if he was initially terrible at it. So when given tips on how to manipulate better, well, obviously he was going to take them. And what is scamming if not the study and application of human predictability, over the tendencies and compulsions we're driven to act on? You know, eating the donut instead of the granola bar, that kind of thing. Well, wouldn't you know it, in his struggle for a cheap way to the top, he fell for somebody else's scam. But some will tell you he's still scamming to this day, in hopes of freedom, incapable of seeing the world beyond his troublesome nature. And finally, number 3, commitments. A combination of the personal and contextual. We don't know why the knight opens dark fountains or spawns titans. I'd imagine there isn't much of a desire to actually end the world. The knight plays its part in the prophecy reluctantly, out of some as of now unseen motivation. And those involved in its plan act the same. Chris even considers abandoning the plan, but they can't forget they promised, and that promise binds them. How is Gerson dealing with these problems, though? I mean, he's dead, obviously, that makes him susceptible to Javel's outburst, and the Shadow Crystal is used to tempt him, much like how Spancer was tempted with knowledge. But how is Gerson trapped by his commitments? Well, this might be where Father Alvin becomes an important part of the story. See, death wouldn't matter too much to Gerson if he didn't have things he wanted to do in the world of the living. He wanted to talk to Alvin again, to resolve the tensions between them that clearly prevent Alvin from moving on, as evident by the fact that Dusty Hammer was here to begin with. Because they wouldn't be able to see each other, however, cognitive dissonance festers, and the psyche becomes more likely to break. Gerson is dealing with a 3-pronged mental battle, which should put him in the right position to take on the role someone wants of him, that being this chapter's more typical secret boss. Granted, I don't think Gerson being a secret boss is necessarily part of the prophecy. You don't have to complete the secret routes after all. But taking on that role does feel similar to fulfilling the other prophecies, in a way. There was some amount of intent put into the situations that made each boss, and in Gerson's case, there is still a boss fight, it's just in a different context than what someone initially planned. Though, that's really the difference, isn't it? Gerson changed the context of the boss fight in his favor. He read between the lines and reinterpreted his history. How did he do that? In my mind, this started with a bit of self-awareness. Gerson understands how tendencies guide behavior, and uses that to teach others. Take, for example, the aftermath of the Jackenstein fight. Moreover, in his letter, Gerson acknowledges that his absence in church, likely driven in part by his differing beliefs over how the prophecy should be handled, was a source of significant turmoil for Alvin, both in life and death. He is taking accountability for the times his own convictions guided him in making the wrong choice, and using the convictions of others as a tool to guide them down a path more favorable. With a proficiency in understanding behavior, Gerson could then practice restraint, both in his teachings and in his hesitancy to read the Shadow Crystal. To put it simply, he chose the granola bar over the donut. And from there, he gained what could be argued as freedom from human impulse. I think that gets to something deeper about human minds. In fact, let me go on a little bit of a tangent. There's this concept in philosophy known as determinism, an idea that our behavior is dictated entirely by external factors, that we don't really make our own decisions. Now, I'm not here to debate the theory itself, but I do believe the scenario we've been given might show us a way to at least perceive the contrary. By Gerson's example, we have the most control over ourselves when we act beyond self-interest, becoming unpredictable to avoid human predictability. This might mean making decisions for the express benefit of others. This might mean taking care of ourselves. But regardless, self-awareness leads to self-control, and so we become the determiners. Makes sense for a world where everyone supposedly has the power of determination, or at least the Lightners do. Does Gerson have determination? Do you need determination to overcome the stress of a situation like Gerson's? Let's get back on topic for now. In particular, let's get back to the whole being dead thing. Gerson is only revived when the Dark Fountain is open. When it closes, that's it. And now, if he were Javel or Spamton, he might try to prevent the Lightners from reaching the fountain by force. Granted, the player's ability to reset will likely get in the way of that plan. No, Gerson can't prevent the inevitable, but he can live forever in a different way, through his enduring legacy. I made this chart last episode to illustrate how technicalities in the prophecy can be worked around for a better outcome. In this scenario, Tenna is injured, but not dead by the standards of the prophecy. And what allows us to save him? Sparing and recruiting the other members of the TV Dark World. Now let's apply this to Gerson's narrative. The canon event here is the sealing of the Dark Fountain. It's not explicitly stated in the prophecy, but logic dictates it just kinda has to happen. Here's where reinterpretation is key though. Gerson will be gone, yes. Their memory of him, however, that stays. And that's prone to being changed. Gerson teaches, equips, and fights alongside the Lightners out of altruism, and out of a desire to treat others how he wanted to be treated. But in doing so, he's changing the way he's perceived, and the lessons those after him will draw on. For Susie, this is an affirmation of her capabilities. For Rousey, this is an acknowledgement of his personhood. And for Chris, it's a reassurance that everything will be okay. He tells each of them what they needed to hear, and through his resilience, he becomes memorable even in our eyes, the player's eyes. He relinquishes control over life at the end of it all, sure, but he makes sure the youth, the next generation, picks up his pen before he goes. It's through the personal that Gerson could change the contextual, and it's through both that he'll be able to affect that last guideline, to resolve his commitments. He needs Susie to relay his letter to Alvin, and he needs the self-awareness to say the right things. So, does he manage it? Well, let's read his letter together and find out. Firstly, Gerson reinforces that he's proud of Alvin. This is something Alvin himself struggles to believe, so starting with this is like getting to the heart of the matter immediately. Next, he tells Alvin his dream matters, relinquishing any struggle and ideology between the two. He apologizes, letting his son's concept of a future take prevalence over his own. And best of all, he encourages his son to make mistakes, to leave the comfort of the certain and explore all possibilities. Because right now, Alvin has the freedom to explore, to experiment, to live life to its fullest. It's only through his time and death that Gerson could fully articulate that. The power of hindsight, I suppose. Some other things I wanted to point out before the end. I mentioned last episode how Susie is tied to the concept of antithesis, and how that concept generally aligns with forces of chaos and freedom. Well, wouldn't you know it, Gerson actively likes going the wrong way, writing his own stories instead of the ones laid out for him. And then there's Lord of the Hammer itself. Some of its concepts end up aligning with the secret route by sheer happenstance, and as such can be more accurate to the story than the prophecies themselves. His whole spiel about rewrites isn't just conjecture. He's already demonstrated how retellings of a narrative can be more true to the narrative's intent, if the soul of the story is recognized. Ironically, Gerson believes in the death of the author, in the supplanting of literary authority by the interpreter of the written work. It just takes the right choices to make your interpretation, your version of the story, legitimate. So then, finally, how do we break this thing? How do Chris, Susie, and Rousey avoid whatever fate is coming their way? Well, wouldn't you know it, these three characters fit into each of the three guidelines, and could use their given solutions. Susie's challenge is purely external. She is the new girl after all. So for her, rewriting destiny involves making moral choices, in particular, making and putting faith in her friends. This will especially manifest in the enemies she's spared, ironic for her considering her initial attitude towards them. Rousey, meanwhile, suffers from his tendency to put himself before others, his so-called nature as a guide to the party. The more self-care he can practice, the more likely he will be to believe there's something more to him than sacrifice, and the more likely he will be to engage in self-preservation. And then there's Chris, bound to the Knight's plan by their guilt over how they were involved in Dessa's disappearance. It's that sense of guilt that needs to be fully explored and resolved, in order to allow Chris escape from commitment and prioritization of their friend's well-being over destiny. Only then will everyone be saved. Susie's growth seems to be a matter of fulfilling the pacifist route. Rousey seems to be moving towards self-acceptance on his own, though I feel our dialogue with him might become more important in later chapters. With Chris, I'm suspicious the egg route might have something to do with remembering and resolving their trauma, or the references to pills and art therapy and whatnot. And of course, the secret route itself is likely to give us more answers on all fronts. Though, when it comes to determining whether or not they will break the prophecy, I'm brought back to a quote by Toby Fox himself. To him, it's not the ending that matters, but what you do on the way there. and how differently it will make things feel once we're out on the other side. Is that a sign of hope? At the very least, it seems that something can be changed. I'm willing to take that as a sign of hope for now. After all, I've had a certain someone help me to feel that way. I've been Dots, and you've been patient. Thanks for that. Make sure to like and subscribe if you took something out of my analysis. And if you really liked it, check out my other videos, especially the Jurassic Park one. I spent so much time on that. In the meantime, always be creative.